Hello and welcome back to the shop. So we're going to go over the procedure for replacing the microcontroller board in the Spectrum 90. For this, we need the static mat, ESD mat, we need the static strap, we'll need a set of metric Allen keys, a Phillips screwdriver, and I'm going to put these off to the side now. So these cameras are purged with dry nitrogen. So there's an internal pressure here of anywhere from 1 to 15 psi. So before we remove the electronics canister here, we should remove the pressure from the camera. So we're going to do that by taking the Schrader valve cap off of the camera, and I will release all of the nitrogen from the camera just by depressing the Schrader valve, much like you would on an automotive tire or a bicycle tire. There we go. Pressure is gone. So I need to remove all of these fasteners here on the collar. So these fasteners I'm going to unthread here. Hopefully you can see that okay. Oops, that would help if I went the right direction. There we go. So I'm going to back these off one by one. Set this fastener aside, and oops, let's try that again. There we go, from behind. So I will remove this fastener. So I'm just going to repeat this step. And there's two collars on this camera, which cover the bearing carrier, and they just come off like this. There's nothing to it. I'm going to set that aside. And then this. There we go. There we go. Okay. Now, we need to remove the canister here. There will be a little bit of suction on the camera. So if possible, you can remove, if the head is tilted in such a way, or in this case, I had a weaker clutch, so I was able to tilt the camera head by hand. But before you take the camera off the vehicle, make sure that this seal screw is accessible. I'm gonna remove the seal screw, just so that we don't have any suction in the electronics canister that would prevent us from removing it or make it more difficult than it needs to be. So at this point, I'm very carefully, I'm going to grab this section of the bearing carrier and the electronics canister, and I'm going to try and separate them here. I'm going to twist the whole camera a little bit, and I'm going to try and remove them just like that. Now, I don't want to pull the can off. You gotta be very careful not to pull the can off all at once. There are components on the board stack that can be knocked off the board if you're not careful, and that will make our lives very difficult. So we'll just very carefully remove this section of the camera. Okay, so we have the Lex can off. I'm just going to set this aside for now. So again, I have my static strap on here. The microboard is this PCB here, and you'll be able to identify it because there's a rotary dial on the microboard here, which just for your information, the rotary dial should be set to 2 by default if it's not already. We have the driver board on the opposite side, the slip ring board, and the interconnect board. So in order to take the microboard off, we'll have to remove the slip ring PCB with a number 1 Phillips. So I'm going to loosen off these Phillips head flathead fasteners here. There we go. There we go. And I'll just set these aside. There we go. Now, there are connectors here and here, and on the opposite side as well, here and here, which join the micro PCB and the driver board to the slip ring board. So you just have to very carefully remove this board. I'm going to hold on to the micro PCB and the driver board with one hand, and with my other hand I'm going to just very carefully separate the two. Lining these up again afterwards is a bit of a challenge, but they just come off like so. And you'll notice that there are, what do we have here? 2 larger connectors on one side here, which plug into the microboard. And then there's 2 smaller connectors here, which plug into the driver board here and here. You'll have a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 position connector here, which plugs into the driver board here, and a 12 position connector here on the driver board on this side, which you can see is on this side of the board. So it should be fairly straightforward how to plug it back in afterwards. Now that I have the slip ring board off, just being mindful of the wiring harness on this side and this side. It's inside the envelope of the board stack here, and we want to keep it that way. If any of these conductors stick out outside of the envelope here, they can rub up against the inside of the can here. So we want to avoid that because the can's going to rotate around here, or rather this is going to rotate inside of the electronics canister. So again, with 2 fingers, I'm just going to very carefully remove the micro PCB. Here we go. Micro PCB comes off just like so. And to plug the new one in, we have a, what do we got here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 position connector on this side, and 2, 4, 6, 8 sec here. All right, so when you go to install the new microboard, just ensure that you have the headers here plugging into the correct side. So on this side here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, 16 pins on this side, and I'm going to count this side here as well. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 16 pins on this side, and 14 pins on this side, and 14 pins on this side. So I know that this connector plugs into here, and this connector plugs into here. Of course, on the opposite side here, we have the same connector on both sides, and this will point up towards the slip ring board. and plug into these two headers here. So just for your information, how many do we got here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 16, 16. So the 16 position connectors point up and the smaller connectors point down. So I'm going to plug this in here again. I'm going to try and avoid the wiring harness as much as I can. And again, so I'm just going to rest this in place here for now. I don't have it seated fully, but just so you can see that on this side here, I'm going to rotate it around this side. Good. I've got it plugged in. You just want to be careful that you don't miss any of the pins on each side here. It's easy to move the connector 2 pins over and overlap and have the board, but you'll know if the board is sitting inside the envelope and it flanges up nicely with the connectors and you don't have any wires pinched in between. If everything looks good, then just go ahead and push the board onto the headers just like that. Now they're installed. I'm going to push some of these wires back inside the envelope here. Maybe I'll wait to put the slip ring board back in. And again, some of these connectors, or wires rather, are sitting a little proud here. I just want to make sure that they're not going to get caught on anything when I go to put the slip ring board back on. And you can see it's fairly self-evident which side plugs in to which side here. So I have 2 16 position connectors on this side, which are going to plug into here. You can see that this connector and this connector are on opposite sides of the board, one smaller, one larger. So you can see that this connector plugs into here, this connector plugs into there, and these 2 connectors plug into this side of the slip ring board. So just have a good look at that. It's fairly self-evident which goes into which, but again, very difficult to line up. These boards aren't necessarily going to be even or sitting straight, so you'll want to line these up very carefully so as to not miss any connectors or any pins rather. So it looks good. I've got both lined up on each side here. So I'm going to push these boards together. All the while I'm looking down through the board stack just to make sure I'm not squishing any wires on this side or this side here, or on the top of the PCB board stack cage. So I'm just going to push these together now. They won't plug in all the way. You're going to see a bit of a gap on each side. It's not to worry. That's normal. You may notice on the bottom here that these headers are not plugged in all the way either. So again, if you have a bit of a gap up top, that's fine. Don't panic. So at this stage, I'm ready to put the flathead fasteners back in. Ideally, they will be reinstalled with a little bit of blue Loctite. Blue Loctite 243. There will be some residual Loctite on the fasteners, so if you don't have any Loctite, it's not the end of the world. Ideally, these will be reinstalled with Loctite, but again, as long as you're reusing the same fasteners, you will have some residual Loctite from factory. So I'm going to put a little Loctite on each fastener as I put them back into the countersinks of the board. And I'm just going to tighten each fastener just a couple of threads for now, just so I don't lose the fastener. Again, I'm going to put Loctite on this one as well and put it into the countersink like that. There we go. Now I've got all the fasteners installed here. So I'm going to tighten these flatheads down, just like so. Okay, let's put that there. Okay, so I'm just going to tighten these fasteners down just to make sure they're nice and snug, and these are just M2.5s, so they're not very big. I wouldn't crank on them too hard. You will risk stripping this. If you do strip it, you can use a longer fastener here, or even put nuts on the other side of the camera cage mount here if needed, but just don't tighten it too much. It's just it's just going into aluminum, so you can over tighten this. Okay, so all of the wiring is nicely tucked inside the camera cage PCV stack cage envelope here. So I'm actually ready to put the electronics canister back on at this point. So I'm going to check the sealing area here along this O-ring and make sure there's no foreign objects or debris or hairs or anything like that. You want to make sure the O-ring is free from any foreign objects. And similarly, the sealing area where the O-ring lands is just this area here. So just inspect this area here and make sure that the surface area here is cleaned up nicely. And there we go. I'm going to reinstall this. I'm going to try my best to line up these holes with the clearance holes on the other side and make this a little easier to install. So I'm just going to force the can together like this. There we go. And then I'm going to have to rotate the back can, as you can see, to line up these holes right here. You can just twist it until those come back into alignment. There we go. So at this point, I'm going to put the collars back in, and I'm going to need to line up the collar clearance holes with the clearance holes in the bearing carrier, which line up to the tapped holes in the electronics canister. So again, I got a little bit of blue Loctite on these. Hopefully you have some. If not, just make sure they're tightened down nicely, and we will have to rely on whatever residual Loctite is left in the tapped hole and on the fastener, which would have been installed from factory. It'll be hard to see any Loctite on there, but it does change color over time, and if it's blue Loctite, it'll look a little bit lighter colored. There we go. Okay. There we go. There we go. I'm just going to tighten all of the electronics canister fasteners. we go. Okay, so we're going to need to purge this camera at some point. There are desiccant packs inside the camera head to absorb any moisture, but the nitrogen is ideal if it could be sourced wherever you're doing the repair on your Spectrum 90. Typically, tire shops will have nitrogen readily available. We purge our cameras. I'm just going to put the seal screw in temporarily for now, just so I don't lose it. I don't have nitrogen. I'm going to cover the nitrogen purge in a separate video, but just for now, I'm going to replace this cap. And the other thing I'd like to do at this point is just check with a digital multimeter and short test the camera. So I want to, again, set this to the ohm setting, and I'm going to just make sure I find a couple of fasteners in the back of the camera head. So I've got a dead short between these two fasteners, which means these fasteners are shorted to the chassis. You'll want to check around and make sure you find two fasteners that you do have no resistance between. The anodizing on the camera can prevent the fastener from having good, what would you say, good electrical ground, let's say between these 2 points here. So just make sure you're making good contact. Check your probes too. Okay, so I'm now going to check every single pin on this camera and just make sure that each pin will go open line. Now, there are components on the board stack that are tied to ground here, so you will get the meter showing a high resistance short, just like you saw with the first pin that I checked here. And just hold your meter on each pin until it goes open line like this. This is what you want to see on each pin. All I'm doing is checking to see if I've pinched anything inside to the chassis, any of the conductors in the harness. So I've checked this. I haven't pinched anything. At this point, we would be ready to plug in the camera for an initial check. Just be careful at this point. In this case, we've replaced the micro PCB, and so we will not have our calibration set on the camera. So the inclinometer, the pitch and roll sensors will display a value, but it will not be calibrated. The pan calibration, so the home position for the pan calibration, will not be set. But what I'm really concerned with at this point is the tilt. The tilt calibration will not be set. So it is possible for you to tilt the camera to the mechanical limits. And if you leave the camera tilting at either of the max or min tilt points, you can burn out the clutch. So just be careful. We're going to cover the setting of the tilt and pan limits and inclinometer in another video. So again, plug the camera in and test, but don't tilt the camera head past the mechanical stop. Just tilt it ever so slightly in each direction to see that you have tilt. But again, don't run it right to each mechanical stop until we've recalibrated the inclinometer and pitch and roll sensors. All right, that is it for the installation. Again, we're going to cover purging and calibration in another video.